Hi there, I'm Peter Millard, and in this episode of the Tracksaw Workshop I'll be making some parallel guides that work both for regular rips and narrow waist-side cuts. That's coming up next. So, neat little cross-cut jig there. What about those narrow rips though? Obviously you can use a pencil mark if you're ripping 300mm strips off a full sheet. What about those rips that are narrower than that? Well, I've made plenty of one-off sort of parallel guides like these. Links down to those videos in the description below. But I figured it was about time that I made some properly adjustable ones like this. Let's see how we get on. Let's just back up a sec and talk about what we mean by a parallel guide. Parallel guides and parallel guide extensions are a festool thing. They attach to a guide rail and let you make parallel cuts that are parallel to the side, to the edge that you're bearing against. Really good for long rips, for example, if you are ripping 300mm strips off a full sheet for the sides of a bookcase, for example. They're very clever, very sophisticated festool ones. They clip onto the side of the rail and they stay attached, so it's very easy and very quick to make these cuts. They also have parallel guide extensions which go on the other side of the rail, which allow you to make narrow cuts as well. So really, really clever. They're also pretty expensive. About 150 quid is the best price I've found for the guides, another 100 or so for the extensions, so 250 odd quid depending on how much you shop around for the full set. Mine, on the other hand, are made from sort of scrap and cost about £1, so unless you're a lawyer on 500 quid an hour, you're probably going to save some money by making your own. These are really simple to make. I make the body as a single piece, whatever size you want. This is about 500mm by 220 or thereabouts, 225. I make them in a single piece and then rip them down so you have two halves that you know are identical. As well as the body, I'm using 6mm MRMDF for this. You need a couple of 6mm strips, and it does need to be 6mm. Again, whatever you want, plywood. I've got lots of MDF, so I'll use that. And these go either side of the main rib on the guide rail. One sits in the trough between the rib and the T-track, and one goes on the other side. And when you actually make the guides, you pinch those together so they fit really snugly on that central rib. And I make these the same size so that we can actually flip them round so they work either way. Now, the body of my parallel guides has a slot cut into it to take the variable stop. It's a movable stop, just a little block of MDF with an N8 bolt sunk into it, and the slot takes the N8 bolt, which is secured in place by a washer and a wing nut. And that's all there is to it. And to start making these, well, we'll go back to our freshly minted cross-cut jig and start cutting the body there. I'm cutting a couple of pieces approximately 200mm by 500mm from an offcut of 6mm MDF for the guide body, then measuring the trough between the guardrail ribs. I'm cutting a couple of spacer strips off one of these, fine-tuning them with a bit of sanding to make for a snug fit. With one of these spacers against the rib on the guide rail, I can mark roughly on the body of our parallel guide where I want the slots to be. And then measure this out properly, using an awl to mark the ends of the slots ready for drilling. I'll be using M8 bolts and wing nuts, so I'm drilling an 8mm hole at either end. And then carefully cutting between them with the track saw. Remember, we need to be on a full plunge for this to get as close to the holes as possible. so I'm making sure there's plenty of clearance under the workpiece. And I'm finishing the slots off with a handsaw, and then some abrasive, before checking that the bolts run freely. With the spacers butted alongside each other, I can run a strip of double-sided over them before separating and attaching one of them to the underside of the parallel guide body. Then, with the other spacer in the trough between the ribs on the guide rail, I can offer up the body into position, pulling the spacer tightly against the rib before pressing it firmly down. And with the body complete, I can cut it in half on the crosscut jig to make our two identical parallel guides. Still at the crosscut jig, I'm cutting a strip of scrap 18mm MDF and then roughly halving it to make our two movable stops. And after marking the centres carefully with pencil marks and then an awl, I can counter drill to take not just the M8 bolts, but also the socket that I'll use to fit them. And finally, I'm drilling through with a 7mm bit and threading the M8 bolts in, driving them home with a socket so they stay captive in the stops. With everything cleared away and our components to hand, assembly is simply a question of putting the stop on the underside of our guides with the bolt poking through the slot and adding a washer and a wing nut to keep it in place. So how does this work? Well, let's say you've got a piece of board that doesn't quite fit onto your crosscut jig, for example. You can use a tape to put a pencil mark where you want your cut to be. Set your rail against the pencil marks. And square it up. Then put our guides firmly onto the rail and move the blocks into position. and screw them down. And with that in place, take the blocks away, make your cut, put them back on, move them up to the next cut. But what about making very narrow rips at the other end? Well, that's easy to do as well. Don't forget to make these waist side cuts. You'll need to allow for the curve, the thickness of the blade as well. You set up your rail where you want it, flip these around the other way, bring the blocks in position and lock them down. Take the guards away, make your cut and move on to the next one with the guides in place. And that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Join me in part 6 when we take a look at tracks and guide rails and see if it's really worth having a go at making your own. I'll see you next time.